More than 3,200 years ago, on Mount Sinai, God described himself to Moses. The Lord, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in love and fidelity, continuing his love for 1,000 generations, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Is that your vision of God? I've met a lot of people in my priesthood. That's not their vision of God. They grew up learning that God is vindictive and petty and angry, quick to anger, slow to offer mercy. Believing God to be this mean ogre ready to strike us down has caused some very, very good people to approach death in fear, not wanting to meet such a vengeful God. It's caused many to refrain from celebrating the sacrament of reconciliation, afraid of hearing of God's wrath. And so today I beg you, as I've begged you in the past, abandon that false teaching. I don't care who taught it to you, whether it was Father X or Sister Y, they were wrong. They filled your head with a very non-biblical understanding of God. The Old Testament describes a God who created everything generously in love and eventually espoused himself, married himself to a little band of people called the Israelites. God loved the Israelites, even when they turned away from him, which they often did. And when they sinned, God sent prophets to remind the people of his great love for them, of his covenant with them. God called the people back to him, challenged them to be faithful to him. And eventually they repented of their evil ways. And God forgave them and restored them to his friendship. But soon after, they sinned again and separated themselves from God. And once again, God pursued them like a jealous lover. He sent new prophets to convince the people to turn back to him. And when they turned back to them, God forgave them. Again and again and again. That's the pattern of the Old Testament. Finally, God said, enough of sending prophets in my name. I will send my son. They will listen to him. So God sent Jesus, who offered the same message as the prophets. We hear that in his opening line in the Gospel of Mark. Repent and believe in the gospel. It's just another way of saying, turn back to me and follow my commandments. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. God desires your salvation, not your destruction. God desires that you have life and have it to the full. That's the message of the Lord. And Jesus confirmed this message throughout his public ministry, a ministry of reconciliation. He healed people of their physical infirmities. He cast out demons. He taught of God's mercy using parables like the prodigal son. He provided concrete examples of reconciliation by forgiving the sins of people, including the adulterous woman, the paralytic, the good thief. The last hurdle to reconciliation was death. Jesus had to defeat death if he was to reconcile the human race to God. And God's plan to defeat sin and death was foreshadowed throughout the Old Testament, including passages like today's from the prophet Ezekiel. Through Ezekiel, God promised to open the graves of the dead and bring them forth and give them new life. Certainly as Christians, we look at this passage and see that God was speaking of the resurrection at the end of time. But to the Israelites, God was also offering reconciliation right then and there. the restoration to the promised land of those who had been exiled because of their infidelity, freedom to those bound by sin. Fast forward about 500 years past Ezekiel to Jesus, who gradually revealed more of God's plan to defeat sin and death, and today by raising Lazarus from the dead. As foretold through Ezekiel, God opened the grave of Lazarus and called him from the dead. Imagine being in Bethany that day, and Lazarus comes out of the tomb bound in burial cloths. And Jesus says, untie him and let him go. Can you imagine his friends? You go do it. You go do it. Yeah, Jesus was directing Lazarus' friends to free him from that linen that bound his body. But Jesus meant much more than that. Jesus was speaking, I think, to his opponent, death. He says, I am more powerful than you. Listen and obey me. Now untie him and let him go. And death had to yield to Jesus. Death surrendered to the resurrection of the life. Lazarus was let go from the grip of death. But that victory that day over death was temporary. Lazarus would eventually die, and his body placed back maybe in that same tomb. God's plan of reconciliation required more than just raising one person from the dead. Jesus needed to taste death himself in order to defeat death. He had to defeat death for himself in order to defeat death for us. Jesus' resurrection was his victory, but it became our victory too. St. Paul confirms that in our second reading today. Paul promised that the same Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will raise us from the dead also. And of course, we look forward to the resurrection of the dead at the end of time. We say that in our profession of faith, one of the last lines. That resurrection at the end of time, well, that's going to usher in an eternal moment of perfect reconciliation with God. But we need not wait until the end of time to enjoy the first fruits of the Lord's victory over sin and death. We can go to the sacrament of reconciliation and encounter the risen Jesus, who listens to us confess our sins and express our contrition for those sins. He then says through the priest, I forgive you. Now go and sin no more. Jesus frees us who were dead in our sins, who were wrapped up in our sins. It's a mini Easter every time we celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation, because God gives us new life, a new start. "3,200 years ago on Mount Sinai, God revealed himself to Moses as gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in love and fidelity, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. 1,200 years after that, Jesus' death and resurrection confirmed God's love and mercy and his desire for us to be reconciled to him. Do not be afraid of that, God. Know that when we sin, we are like the Israelites who turned away from God. And God will pursue us, just as he pursued the Israelites. When we sin, we are like Lazarus, bound in the tomb. We don't want to live like that. Celebrate the sacrament with Jesus and hear him announce the same beautiful words of freedom and forgiveness and healing he spoke in Bethany. Untie her and let her go.